Hello and welcome to Simply Tax. It's March 27th, 2020, and over the period of the last few short weeks, the new coronavirus pandemic and the response to it both globally and domestically has had a pervasive impact on us all, both personally and professionally. To help you respond to this often sobering reality and cut through the static of the headlines swirling in both the tax and business world, we'll be focusing on the tax and business-related developments and strategies to approaching this unprecedented, fast-moving, and challenging environment in our next few episodes of the podcast. To start off our COVID-19 response series, I called up my colleague Chris Schumann to get some much-needed advice and practical tips that businesses, their owners, and their families can implement right now to confront the unexpected business challenges and perhaps inevitable financial effects stemming from the pandemic. As we discuss in the episode, Chris's insights are based on lessons learned from what he's seen that worked and what didn't in business responses to previous crises and downturns. The goal of this episode is to help you and your business develop a playbook or maybe a short-term bridge to ride out the current situation. You can learn more about Chris in the show notes of this episode, which are available at bkd.com/simplytax. You can also get resources on important tax and accounting changes and learn about the latest tax and accounting developments related to the response to the new coronavirus at bkd.com/covid-19-resource-center. Let's go ahead and get started with navigating the unprecedented, but perhaps not uncharted territory of responding to business uncertainty.
Damien, it's great to talk with you today. My name is Chris Schumann, and I am a part of the BKD Next service group that really we focus on helping founder owners and closely held businesses through their life cycle and ultimately into the realms of transition, whether that's a transaction or a transfer to next generation or management or what have you. One of the things that we tend to focus on is we're talking about the life cycle and over the life of a business. And so as a result, we spend a lot of time helping businesses grow, helping businesses identify their secret sauce, how they compete. We delve into strategy and so forth. At this point in time, it's probably worthwhile taking a step back, taking stock of what's going on, the here and the now, the coronavirus pandemic that we're faced with, and how middle market, lower middle market companies are responding, or maybe things they need to be thinking about. Interestingly enough, my background, if I think back 20 years or so, was probably the first time that myself and some of my teammates were involved in what I'd call turnaround light. And it was primarily helping closely held manufacturing companies weather the bumps in 2000, 2001. Again, we had to get that tool or that approach off the shelf again in 2007, 8, and 9. And it's eerily similar that we're back there again today. That said, this situation just seems different. And for all of the historians out there, or those of us with some stripes, I think you understand what I'm saying. Whereas maybe 07, 08, with a bank crisis and a financial crisis that worked its way through the economy, this is really something. How quickly, we've kind of done almost the full stop, if you will. My analogy to the Titanic, and that's not lost on me. I don't mean to do that. Not trying to be dark here, but full stop in terms of directives to stay home, to shelter in place. If you're not an essential business, to close your doors for a time. So, this is really interesting, and how quickly it's come about, and how quickly it's impacting our clients and impacting businesses out there. I think another difference, this is, again, one guy's opinion. Another difference, though, is it feels like, at least in the small business realms of our economy, that SBA, government, et cetera, is quicker here to respond. I mean, it does feel like help is on the way. I mean, we had legislation that's working its way through Congress. We've been directed now to the SBA's website for Treasury Direct assistance for many of our smaller or mid-sized clients. And I don't remember that being readily available so quickly, and certainly not, available directly from Treasury as it is this time. So it is a unique time. I feel like help's on the way, and perhaps folks are heeding the lessons that we learned the last time around and are trying to react here a little more quickly.
It's very apparent of how quickly this is, and just the conversations even I've been having with people of, like you said, that making that full stop and then having to turn, make a hard turn or assess. Are you hearing that? Are you seeing that? And maybe what does that mean to your strategy at this point in time if you're making such a hard stop and a hard turn?
Again, it's kind of trying times, interesting times. I think maybe some of us are still a little bit in shock. I'm encouraging my clients to gather up their executive teams and to talk it through. It's time for commiserating, and then let's move on and start thinking about plans and how do we weather this. One of the areas that has always boded well for us in helping clients, and really, if you think about those that survive and thrive, best practice, they really take a hard look at cash. I mean, cash is king. You always hear that, and it's important to more than ever to understand your cash position. A long time ago, I think we were doing some turnaround work for one of the local banks, and the credit officer referred to it as a collateral plan. I was thinking cash plan, but he was going to up the stakes and called it a collateral plan. So, understanding where you stand from a cash position is really critical right now. And the process of going through that, actually, there's a good chance, and I'd venture to say a very, very likely chance that management teams, ownership groups are going to uncover opportunities to be creative, to make the cash last longer, to be creative in how they're timing and sequencing expenditures and the like to weather the storm. So I guess the first point I would make is now more than ever is it's time to probably institute something that looks and feels like a 13-week cash flow forecast. Let's keep it practical. One of the things some of us tend to fall in love with our spreadsheets, and I would suggest that we guard against that. Let's start with the big rocks. Understand your large receivables, your large payables, certainly payroll, other fixed expenditures, maybe some debt service types of items, and lay that out before yourselves in a way that you can begin to understand the timing. And then you can see the sensitivity and really how much altitude you really have. And that's really, I think, probably the most important place to start. So that 13-week cash flow forecast.
Yeah, and I like how you say make it practical because I feel like, right, like you said, the spreadsheets sometimes of what's even worked in the past. This is kind of a uncharted territory for sure and unprecedented times. So probably going with the same old spreadsheet that you've had, it might work, it might not work. Are there any specific things maybe that you find that people sometimes overlook when trying to keep it practical, or maybe overcomplicate even?
I think folks tend to overcomplicate it. As an example, your payroll number, if it's a biweekly or even a weekly, it doesn't have to be the exact number. Let's round up and come up with what that number is that represents that obligation that you're going to have, each week or each and every other week, and that's important. From a receivable and a payable perspective, start with just your typical aging buckets. And then once you can see out 6 or 7 or 8 weeks, then it's time to be a little more detailed. The reason you're going to do that is as you begin to develop plans around accelerating receipts or delaying expenditures, you're going to need another level of detail to do that. But again, I guard against getting overly complicated. When you get out beyond 6 or 7 weeks, it becomes more and more a forecast. It's going to be wrong as soon as you're done. But as you're starting to think about future orders or potential, customer sales orders and or planned purchase orders that are kind of beyond the current cycle of your business, those become a little more of an estimate. But likewise, you still need to keep track of those, as you're planning out on the horizon. So, when you begin to think about the specifics, then let's just take receipts. So accounts receivable. Once you've developed your initial forecast of cash flow, then it's time to take a look at on a customer by customer basis what the past performance of that customer is and how do you see it changing any. If they were quick pays or if they tended to take you out a full 45 or 60 days, then model that as such. But as you go through that process, there should be some learning going on, and you ought to figure out, okay, where can we affect this? Where can we change maybe that behavior? Are there certain customers that have been longtime customers of ours? They're willing, they have the ability to maybe accelerate to help us out a little bit? Are there others that we know that their industry is probably getting hurt as hard as maybe we are, or the fact of the matter is they're going to be slower pays, and we need to figure out where we can go harvest cash elsewhere. So, that's kind of the customer side. Another real important piece, and this is related, and we'll talk about this a little bit more about our staff and our payroll, our employee base. But mistakes of the past, I can tell you there are numerous situations where I watched firsthand where 2008, let's say, in a race to the bottom, payroll was cut or reduced from the standpoint of trying to get to a number, and that meant maybe a veteran rainmaker, experienced salesperson was paid more than maybe some junior folks. It was a target and got us to that payroll reduction that we needed. But as a result, we lost that important relationship with a key customer. We lost that leadership. And so, it's very important that with our customer facing people that, now is not the time just to go headlong into slashing. We need to be really surgical and thoughtful about retaining, the DNA of our companies, the expertise, and so on.
That's great advice, because especially in this case, like you said, it's such a quick and fast ramp up, and perhaps that things were going well going into this. And I've had even some of those conversations who are saying, things were off to a great start this year. Now what do? We put the brakes on. You almost kind of have to, chop off your nose to spite your face, to almost to speak, when we kind of come out the other side. Obviously, there's a lot of speculation. There's a lot of uncertainty. But at the same time, right, you don't want to hamstring yourself for later on down the road, it sounds like you're saying.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Yeah, one other area and this actually took months to take place. And so I would suggest that if we can accelerate this and pull this forward. When I say it took months to take place, I'm referring back now, 12, 13 years ago, where it didn't seem like there was any end in sight. Today we don't know how long this is going to really last. Are we going to start going back to work here in a matter of weeks or months? How much collateral damage will have been done? But in that instance, if I go back to 2008, in the latter stages, the deepest, darkest time, and starting to look at, okay, which products do we have to abandon, and what expertise or capability do we need to jettison just to stay afloat? If we had a new innovative product that had just come through launch, but maybe it didn't have traction just yet, it was probably on the shelf or going to get shelved. I would just advocate that, if we've got bright opportunities that existed just 3 or 4 weeks ago, that we don't get too hasty in closing down those opportunities for the future and really foregoing that capability. Another related topic is pricing. I remember this like it was yesterday, and you get to the proverbial race to the bottom. Maybe you feel like if we just cut prices, maybe we can pick up some sales. And you really need to stop and ask yourself, has our value proposition changed any as a company? Is the products or services that we offer in any way really diminished with what's transpired here? And if the answer is, and it's more than likely, the answer is probably no, unless unfortunately maybe your service is in the leisure and recreation space today, which is really unfortunate. But if the answer is no, then I would really caution against wholesale slashing of pricing. The prices that you give up today are going to be pretty hard to recapture in the future. And so rather, maybe a better solution is more of a short-term promotional discount. Even we'll give you discounts if you can pay more quickly than it is to go and get into a competitive race, if it's a competitive situation, to the bottom by slashing prices. Don't go there if you don't have to. And if you do, make it a special circumstance that you can very quickly unwind.
I like how you're talking also a little bit about kind of how others in the process might impact you. Again, talking about kind of the customers, what that'll mean, and maybe the supply chain as well. So maybe could you speak to what you can do in managing some of the risk with collections and so forth as we kind of go through this process?
Well, I think it starts obviously with communication. For key customers, I think it becomes paramount that senior leadership of the company is having dialogue with those key customers. They're business partners of yours. We're better off together than apart. We don't want to become adversarial. So, With those customers, if we understand where they're at, if we can come to agreements and be communicating, then we have a better chance of planning. If I know a key customer is going to have a hard time paying an invoice of mine, then what has been historically kind of normal terms is, if I know that, and if I've got a frank enough relationship that they're going to share that with me, I can plan to it. You can't plan for what you don't know. So it starts there. I think likewise, though, with customers, if you've got some real slow pays or customers that are the minor accounts, you do need to lean in, and we can't just ignore those, because those small onesie twosies, small accounts can add up to become a problem for you if you just have taken your eye off the wheel, so to speak, from a collection perspective. So there, it's important to stay on top of collections and being in contact with that customer base. It may be worthwhile to extend additional terms, give folks a little more time. When it really got bad in 08, 09, I remember accepting payment plans with certain customers, because that was the best they could do. The key there was we were communicating and working together to get through the issue. So I think that's an important piece. Damien, we like to think in terms of stakeholders. So you've got customers, another stakeholder would be those suppliers, those key suppliers. And the first thing, and I was taught this by a client of mine a long time ago, when he reminded me that supplier needed the sale as bad as we needed the material. Now that may seem a little arrogant, but we need to remember that we're partners in this, and we do have some leverage. And unless you're just a super small customer of a super big supplier, you have some leverage, and they want to get paid, and they need to sell their goods to be profitable and to be in business. Not to say that we've got a whole bunch of leverage in that negotiation or that discussion, but we should be mindful of that and not be afraid to be transparent, to share, and to lay out what we're able to do and what we're not able to do. That's really key in that supply chain. The other thing is, when things have gotten tough in the past, a strategy that we've used has been, to go find alternative sources of products or service that maybe had more favorable terms, better pricing, but more importantly, and especially if we're talking about a manufacturer, that have maybe shorter lead times. We didn't switch before, even though we had entertained an alternative supplier. We didn't out of maybe loyalty. Well, in this circumstance, if times are dire, maybe it's no longer that risky to take that chance to try out that supplier that has a shorter lead time, that has maybe better terms, because they're aggressively looking to grow. I hope we don't get to this point, but if this slowdown, if this full stop is protracted, I can remember many a call where we would agree with our supplier to maybe just park or suspend payment on some really old payables that we had, that we would get current with current orders, current purchases, and then establish kind of a payment plan to catch up the past due stuff. I hope we don't go there. I hope we don't get there. But again, it's all things are negotiable, and communication and transparency is important, and leveling with folks in terms of where you are and what you can do.
I think that's great advice, right? Because sometimes, again, when we get into this mode, you almost kind of batten down the hatches, so to speak, almost, right? And so as a result of that, perhaps don't leave all the options on the table by increasing communication. You had said something earlier too that kind of dovetails with that, and that's even just bringing in the team internally to kind of just think about how you're going to approach this. Maybe there's outside of the box kind of ideas within the team to approaching this challenge. Have you seen that in the past when kind of maybe dealing with previous crises or even the previous downturn and recession that we experienced?
Absolutely. And I've got a teammate of mine that had ran a business, was a part owner, and sold that business very successfully, but came through the recession as well. I don't want to say fondly, but he does reflect on how the experience caused his team to get creative. He talks about don't stand there and just get pecked to death, change, move. And I think there's a lot of wisdom there. There's a lot of opportunity to maybe pivot, whereas a decision or a strategy may have seemed a little risky in the past. Faced with the alternative, it may not seem as risky. And another point, I think back One of the situations I found myself in was a turnaround. This was probably in late '09, and so a lot of the damage had been done. But this particular company had a Navy commander as the CEO, and he was phenomenal at organizing the troops and really harnessing the energy of the group. But in that instance, that's probably the most effective I've seen a team at really divvying up real challenging issues. Instead of accepting kind of the norm, the status quo, that product requires that material and there's no other way around it, and we're going to have to pay to get that material. It's going to be a premium, and something else is going to have to sacrifice to do that in order to make that order. Instead, he would challenge small groups of folks and give them the authority to get creative about it. And I can think of numerous examples where, the team came up with alternatives, a substitution of material, maybe a change to the process, things along those lines to kind of change the rules of the game and take those handcuffs off that otherwise I think folks that weren't being as open-minded and creative would have kind of forced on themselves. Another time I can recall a group that really did a nice job. They kind of divvied up their fixed operating costs into smaller groups of people and really challenged each other to say, what really is fixed and what's really necessary. Everything had this, is it necessary or is it kind of a nicety? Necessary or nice? And to go through and determine where they could actually make some cuts. In that instance, after that company had built its 13-week cash roller and had kind of laid in the assumptions, they came up short and they concluded we've got to reduce cost. The challenge was it's going to either come out of people or we got to get that cost out from the organization, non-people related costs. And they went a long way to reducing cost without having to affect people. And again, tasking a small group with leadership, that's going to bear fruit. Is it going to get you all the way home? Maybe, maybe not. Depends on the duration of this and the severity of this crisis, I guess. But there's definitely many examples where companies, where leadership teams have come together to affect change and reduce that cost structure.
At this point in time, you just kind of have to learn about what worked, what didn't work, and then consider anything and everything. So yeah, maybe that end. Do you have any more do this or don't do this from the last crisis that we had?
I really haven't touched so much on the people side. And for many organizations, their people costs are their largest expenditure. For manufacturers, it's usually the second largest behind material. But again, from a people standpoint, I'm holding out hope here that for those small and mid-sized companies that there will be some payroll relief on the horizon via SBA and the disaster loans and some of the other things that are out there. I was on calls until late last night with a few of my clients where they've indicated that their banker is willing to work with them, that their landlord was willing to work with them, and so forth, so that they didn't have to begin to make cuts to their workforce. But along those lines, I think it's very important that we don't carve up our capabilities and capacity, some of our technical expertise. And again, having been faced with looking down the roster, in some pretty tough times in the past, whether we chased a number, we had a number needed to balance. So we had to reduce headcount to get to that number versus, all right, every department's going to have to feel the pain and give up a couple of people. And it's usually the junior people. And I would venture to say that both of those approaches just were not the right way to go. And I know from experience, you're better off taking a very thoughtful approach to the organization and where the future, think in terms of what the future of the business needs and where it's going, and preserve those capabilities, that expertise within your organization for the future. And the other area is, I've seen too many founder-owner businesses on a turn of a dime pretty much eliminate their customer-facing folks, the big cuts to the sales team and so on. Boy, what do you do then if you have nobody out selling, right? And so it's important that we're not that hasty, that we take a thoughtful approach to people costs, and that we preserve the capabilities and the secret sauce, the value add of our businesses.
No, and that's probably a top concern of even just the reactions that I've seen and heard so far is, what do I do for my people? Right. I mean, and it's just such a challenging situation, and obviously you care about your people deeply, oftentimes, particularly well, in any business, but particularly with your closely held family owned type situations, right? And they're part of the family almost. So you're right. That's you're faced with some really, really tough decisions. And I appreciate what you say there on kind of how to approach that.
Thinking back, it was probably winter of '08, and faced with a tough challenge with a company that was really struggling. This was up in the RV space. So you can, they tend to really get whipsawed through the peaks and valleys of the economy. The key there was the owner leveled with the employees, and it was a smaller company, probably less than 70, and they were family. And that group, think about, they're on the holidays and so forth. And the key there was, and how he kept the band together, was he was transparent, and he was forthright and shared with people. There was a group that came together, and again, this was after a long, kind of protracted months and months of no end in sight, and the collective came up with the idea of a pay cut. And again, I hope we're not going to be doing this long enough that we're having this conversation, but I don't know that we lost more than 2 or 3 individuals who felt they had to leave the company with that, because everybody understood. There was a shared sense of sacrifice, and they weathered that. The sun is shining today, Damien, and we need to turn a corner here. One other area that has been interesting, and this is just over the last 48 hours or so, is we are, and we're comparing notes within the firm, kind of internally, and what we're hearing. And some of the non-essential businesses have decided to idle for a time. There has been some stoppages within the automotive supply chain and so forth. In most cases so far, the early indication is everybody's aggressively looking to see what help they can get from lenders, from SBA, from others, with the hopes that this isn't going to be as protracted, and they can keep things intact here.
Right. Perhaps as a byproduct of this being so quick, and even like you said, the reaction from SBA and all that of providing some of these resources, it's maybe really geared at some of these helping through some of these things, because you don't want to make these really tough decisions where you sometimes can even cut too deep, as you're saying, if you're not careful, if you can avoid them. So really kind of, again, assessing all options, keeping everything on the table, and really trying to think creatively seems to be key, both on the operations side and obviously on the people side too. But yeah, and I guess maybe this also touches back to that operations side. But if you are managing inventory, or you have inventory, what do you do on that side of things?
Yeah, that's another, I think, good place to go looking. If you're a manufacturer, or if you're a distributor and you have inventory, and our playbook always used to be, it's all right, what cash can we harvest from the balance sheet? And the first place to go looking is obviously inventories. I would just venture to say, even though many of us profess to be lean and really operate with just-in-time inventories and so forth, when times are good, we tend to get a little bloated. We round up on that purchase or that receipt because we get a better price and so forth. There's probably good behavior when times are good, but there's a lot of opportunity. I've seen many a time where a management team's been able to harvest cash from their inventories. If that means drawing down WIP, shrinking that which is kind of in process, through the manufacturing process. It may be reducing or holding off on a purchase, slowing it down so that we're bringing in materials more in line with how we plan to convert those to products. There's usually opportunities to be found in, again, reducing inventories. That turns very quickly into cash flow that can be used to make that next necessary purchase, or to make that payroll, so that you can live to fight another day, if you will. Sometimes after you've kind of exhausted that, there's often, again, for manufacturers, there'll be items in inventory that maybe are slow moving, or even probably at risk of being obsolescent. It's kind of a rule of diminishing returns to call the auctioneer and see what you can get for salvage value and so forth. If times get that tough, that's always an option too. That there's ways to convert slow moving inventory into much needed cash as well. But I would say place to start is with inventory that's turning. Tighten that up, tighten up that which is used on a regular basis. shorten those lead times with your suppliers, and again, do a good job of syncing up what you're bringing in, what you're paying for, to what you're going to quickly convert to products. And as a result, you'll naturally reduce your inventory, and that you will turn to cash. Now, it's kind of a one-time pop, but it certainly helps.
Are there any approaches that you would suggest, even like you said, to looking at that tightening up? Because perhaps maybe you feel like you've kind of already squeezed it. Are there any tricks up the sleeve or tips that you would offer maybe to doing that? To again thinking of something that you maybe not already have realized.
Well, without getting, I guess, too far into the weeds, I always look at inventory in terms of what's my lead time usage of inventory, meaning, over how long it takes me to fill orders, how much of that inventory do I have on hand? And oftentimes you'll find there's opportunities to reduce that inventory to better line up with what your lead time is. Rather than bringing in larger orders, receipts, the strategy often is to cut smaller purchase orders that are going to fit closer within my cash flow cycle, but just more frequently. So that's one way that you can kind of increase the velocity of those dollars that you're using to purchase and materials and convert to products. The classic way of looking at inventory: what are your turns? If your turns are excessive, and what I like to do is first pass is calculate what my turns are for everything I have, looking at how much do I have versus how much I sell typically, and then draw a line at the average, and everything that's above that average, let's reduce it. Okay, we want to focus on those big items that are going to get us the biggest impact, the biggest lift, by working off those inventories.
You talked a little bit about some of the communication being so important with the customers, with the suppliers, with employees, even in the inventory process, right? So any other tips or suggestions, best practices maybe on the approach with just overall communication?
To me, if you haven't already established, maybe it's a weekly forum or a weekly call, but to be transparent and to provide updates is really important. Those of us that are kind of in the fight, so to speak, I probably fail sometimes to recognize that in the absence of information, folks, they're liable to believe the rumor. They're liable to make up to fill the gap for what they don't know. And so, constant communication and reassurance is really critical with employees. Another area, though, that I would stress, and it's very important, and I'm hearing this by example here just over the last couple of days, reaching out and being proactive with your lender, with your banker. If you have a credit facility, to be talking with them about it and where you stand. I have a very, very good client of mine just this morning shared that their lender was willing to basically waive next month's payment just to give them a little extra time. Whether it comes to renegotiating a line of credit, or whether it's just getting some accommodation, that communication is important. And I'll tell you, when you have been proactive and when you can share your 13-week cash flow forecast with that vendor without them having asked for it in advance, and when you have action plans that you can speak to, and you're tracking how much sales is maybe down from last year, same period, and you can begin to explain that to them, they're going to be a lot more confident that you're on the ball, that you're keeping tabs on things. I'd like to think that with that kind of proactiveness and that kind of behavior, you're going to get benefit of the doubt, more times than not. And so communication with your lender is also an important piece.
And I appreciate kind of all these different angles, because you kind of got to think about all the different facets of the business and how it affects everything. So maybe going back up to the high level again, what overall words of wisdom would you have, or suggestions would you have on approaching this right now in this situation?
To me, it's understand your current position, your cash position. Accuracy over precision is key there. Don't get lost in your spreadsheet. Start high level, and then as you need to, you can build that out and provide more detail if it allows you to be more tactical and make discrete decisions about this customer, that this vendor, that these choices about payroll and so forth. So I think that's an important piece. Another is by all means, be communicating with your stakeholders, even if you don't have all the answers. Leadership, includes maybe admitting when you don't have all the answers, but that you're working at it, and that folks can be rest assured that you have their best interest in mind, and you're doing all that you can. And again, the analysis, if there is the analysis here, the cash flow forecast is all about helping you to kind of uncover what things can we change with how we're approaching our customers, our customer plan, our vendor plan, our inventory plan, even our employee plan. You've got to start somewhere, and that usually begins with something like that cash flow forecast.
It sounds so simple. Admittedly, very probably a lot more to it, right? Because it's always the simple things that sometimes are the hardest. But if you avoid overcomplicating it and just keep it practical, that cash flow analysis and forecast that's huge. One other thing that's kind of just popping in my head here is we're kind of talking about again, even communicating with the bank and the like. But I know kind of just maybe the nature of the cycle of where things have been, and how much interest there's been in a lot of deals and transactions, both on the buy and the sell side lately, coming into this. Any thoughts, or maybe it's again too soon to tell, how it impacts deals, or maybe even if you're in the middle of a deal? And that's sort of like got me thinking down that road, thinking, oh gosh, yeah, what if you've been in negotiations or something, and now we're in the middle of this, and perhaps that communication would help. But yeah, I don't know what you would say kind of to that topic, and kind of how it's looking so far, what you're seeing and hearing with regard to deals and transactions.
Good question. As a next advisor, this is typically the kind of the culmination of our work, and that is helping a closely held business, a founder, owner, a family realize their dreams, whether it's the transition or the transaction, internal or to a third party. The jury's still out. It's too early to tell, and I really can't go out on the record here in terms of what multiples are going to be in 9 months. But I can tell you just anecdotally with some of my clients, I've had an ESOP transaction it was still pretty early in the process, and in that case, it became very apparent that the fair market value that was going to be diminished, and so in this case, the owners decided to hold off. So they've kind of put the transaction on ice. I've got a couple of other transactions that were involving third parties, and in those instances, I think one is probably going to be on hold. One feels like it's kind of unraveling, and there's another one I think they're far enough along they're going to try to get the transaction closed. The goal was to close yet this month. So, again, I'm not answering your question because it still seems like it's a little early to call it. But, advice to that founder owner out there today, and that is if the current circumstance is going to diminish the value that you're going to get for your business, it's probably wise to take a kind of a wait and see. If you're in a space or an industry where that's not the case, there's probably not a reason to hold up a transaction. What's going to be the long-term implications here for maybe the M&A market? Will we still see record numbers of deals and so forth? Boy, you got to assume that there's going to be some negative impact given all of this, at least for a period of time. But I think it still kind of remains to be seen. Obviously, you can go industry by industry and see where the damage seems greatest, at least the most immediate impact. And I'm certain that's probably having an effect on those buyers and sellers willing to come together and strike a deal.
Maybe some closing thoughts and kind of bringing everything full circle. I appreciate all the things that you've said. I feel like very helpful, right? Very practical. What do you need to do right now? But yeah, if you were going to kind of leave everyone here with some final thoughts, what would you say?
Well, I think final thoughts. I would still be encouraged. This is still very early in this circumstance, in this, I hate the word, in this crisis. But I feel like businesses are reacting more quickly. I feel like the SBA and some of the other agencies seem to be acting more quickly, and maybe it's because of how pervasive this has been and where it's striking first. It's not just been a Wall Street bank problem for on the news to start. This is hitting home. So with that, just as quickly as it's happening, I would echo what you're saying, Damien. I'm hopeful that this will also maybe abate just as quickly. We'll see where it goes. Certainly there'll be a dent, there'll be some damage, but nothing that we can't overcome. And I would just challenge all of us to think in terms of our business, day-to-day, the cash flow requirements, what we need to keep the wheels on, to keep marching forward, but also not lose sight of the opportunity to pivot here. There's always opportunities to innovate, to improve. And whereas 4 weeks ago, maybe there was an opportunity that would have seemed risky, today, what do you got to lose? Maybe it's an opportunity that turns out to be just a phenomenal driver of your business in the future. So, with that, let's stay positive and resilient. We'll get through this.
Well, Chris, thank you. Appreciate you taking the time. And like I said, I think we're going to need to loop back here and take a closer look at some of these things as things continue to develop. So yeah, thank you again.
Absolutely. Thank you, Damien.
That's it for now. We'll be back on your feed soon with more to help you respond to the tax and business challenges of the current situation. Up next, we'll cover the tax developments and considerations related to COVID-19 and share answers to the understandably large number of questions that BKD's National Office Tax Team received but weren't able to cover on their March 26, 2020 webinar on the topic, which you can find an archive of on our COVID-19 Resource Center available at bkd.com. We want to know how the pandemic is impacting you, your family, and your business right now, and the topics that you would like to know more about. Please drop us an email at simplytax@bkd.com and let us know. We would also really appreciate your feedback on the podcast with a rating and review on Apple Podcasts or wherever you get your podcasts. I'm Damien Martin. Stay safe and sanitized, and thank you for listening.
The information contained in this episode of Simply Tax is based on data available as of the date of its release. BKD is under no obligation to update this information if changes occur. Applying this information to your specific situation requires careful consideration of all facts and circumstances. Any information provided is not to be considered as tax, legal, or financial advice. Please consult your tax advisor before acting on any matters covered.